really nice clock. This clock's got to be worth 700 bucks. And the piece I'm standing on, a very expensive air conditioner, I think it's got to be worth 500 bucks.
When Storage Wars first hit TV, it looked like a simple game of bidding on abandoned lockers in search of hidden treasure. But beyond entertainment, Storage Wars showed real people that fans rooted for week after week. But behind the scenes, some of the show's most beloved faces were fighting battles that had nothing to do with storage units. So how did their stories end? And what dark turns happened when the cameras stopped rolling? Join us as we remember those Storage Wars stars who passed away too soon. Mark Balelo. From the moment Mark Balelo appeared on Storage Wars, he was impossible to miss. While other bidders showed up in work boots and faded t-shirts, Mark walked into auction houses looking like he had just stepped out of a magazine spread. He carried himself with a swagger that made people either love him or hate him, and he seemed to enjoy both reactions equally. They called him Rico Suave, and the nickname fit perfectly. Before Storage Wars, Mark had built a legitimate business empire. He owned Balelo Incorporated, a liquidation and wholesale company that bought and resold massive quantities of merchandise. For a time, he also ran a gaming store called Game Exchange. He understood value, inventory, and the art of the deal better than almost anyone in the auction game. When he bid on a locker, he didn't do it blindly. He calculated risk the way a card counter calculates a blackjack table, and more often than not, he walked away with something valuable. From the outside looking in, Mark Balelo had everything. A successful business, a hit television show, fans who adored him, money that most people could only dream of. But all that flash and confidence was hiding something deeper, something that had been festering for years. In 2009, Mark was arrested on drug-related charges. He pleaded guilty, served 60 days in jail, and was placed on 3 years of probation. At the time, he told anyone who asked that he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up with people he barely knew. Some people believed him, others weren't so sure. Then, 2 years later, reports surfaced that Mark had violated his probation. A weapon had been found in one of his storage lockers. Around the same time, he became locked in a bitter custody battle for his children, a personal war that drained him emotionally and financially. He left California to deal with the situation, violating the terms of his probation again. The legal system began tightening around him, and the man who seemed so confident on television was slowly unraveling in real life. February 9th, 2013, marked the beginning of the end. Mark was arrested again, this time on charges of possessing methamphetamine and being under the influence of a controlled substance. He was booked, processed, and released, with a court date scheduled for February 19th, just 10 days away. 10 days that he would never see. After his release, he called his ex-fiancée, Elizabeth Metzidis. He told her something that should have sounded every alarm. He was afraid he might hurt himself. Elizabeth rushed to his office immediately. They spent hours talking, and for a while, it seemed to help. Elizabeth left him at his office on the evening of February 10th, believing the crisis had passed. She was wrong. The next morning, an employee arrived at Mark's auction house and found his car in the garage with the engine still running. The garage door was closed. Mark was inside. The coroner later confirmed what everyone had feared: death by self-inflicted carbon monoxide poisoning. He was 40 years old. But as tragic as Mark's story was, it wasn't the only one. While his story ended in that garage, another Storage Wars star was about to face a different kind of nightmare. What if the next battle didn't come from the mind, but from a body already failing? Daryl Sheets. The man they called the Gambler had a reputation for ignoring odds. On Storage Wars, Daryl Sheets would throw thousands of dollars at a locker without seeing inside, trusting his gut over logic. Sometimes, he walked away with treasures worth 10 times his bid. Other times, he left with garbage. Either way, he never seemed to sweat it. That same attitude nearly killed him. By early 2019, Daryl had been feeling wrong for months. His legs were swollen in ways that made him pull up his pant cuffs and frown. But at 60 years old, he told himself the same thing he always told himself at auctions when the bidding got too high. Walk away. There's always another locker. Except this time, the locker was his own body, and he refused to walk away. Then came the night that changed everything. He felt a crushing weight slammed across his chest, the unmistakable feeling that someone had reached inside his ribcage and was squeezing his heart. By the time he reached the hospital, doctors had a word for what was happening: congestive heart failure. Every breath was a battle. And the mild heart attack he had just suffered was the final warning his body could give. The news came out slowly, and it was Daryl himself who informed his fans. He wrote, "Well, here we go. I wasn't going to say anything, but you all have been the greatest friends and fans. I've been very sick for 3 months, and 2 nights ago, I had a mild heart attack. Found out I have congestive heart failure and a serious issue going on in my lungs. All your prayers will be deeply appreciated." The post hit fans hard, finding out that someone they loved so much had been fighting for his life while appearing fine on the surface. Thousands of prayers and well wishes came from people who understood that Daryl had flipped a coin on his health. Daryl underwent surgery and spent weeks in the hospital, much of it in intensive care. There were moments when doctors weren't sure he would pull through. A man in his 60s with heart failure and lung complications doesn't have the same odds as a younger patient. The Gambler was facing the worst bet of his life, but Daryl Sheets has never been good at folding. Slowly, impossibly, he began to improve. By the time he left the hospital, the rumors of his death had already been proven wrong. But only a few years after the world heaved a sigh of relief that Daryl came back alive, something worse lay in wait for him. In April 2026, Tiffany Sheets, Daryl's daughter, arrived at her father's house for a scheduled dinner, only to find him unconscious again. But this time, it wasn't a stroke. Daryl had taken his own life. One day after Daryl's death, Storage Wars cast member Renee revealed in an interview with TMZ that Daryl was dealing with serious cyberbullying. Renee did not name the individual, but said Daryl had shown him hundreds of messages over the previous 3 months. The investigation is still active as the police are still trying to find out the bully. It's sad that Daryl fought so hard for his life against his heart failure, and yet only a few years later, took that same life by himself. But what happens when the enemy doesn't announce itself at all? The next story is even more haunting. Mo Prigoff. If a fan only watched Storage Wars Texas for a few minutes, they might have mistaken Morris Prigoff for a background character. He wasn't the loudest bidder. He showed up, bid with confidence, and walked away with his winnings like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Because he had. What the cameras never fully captured was that Mo, as everyone called him, had already lived an entire lifetime before he ever stepped in front of a lens. And not just any lifetime, 2 of them. For 45 years, Morris Prigoff was a podiatrist. He treated feet and lower calves in Oak Cliff and North Dallas, graduated from the Ohio College of Podiatric Medicine, and became a respected member of the Texas Podiatric Medical Association. He supported the March of Dimes and the American Heart Association. He was, by every measure, a healer. Then, somewhere along the way, he discovered storage auctions, and the healer became a hunter. For over 30 years, Mo collected antiques and contemporary furniture. By the time Storage Wars found him, he had already spent a decade selling his pieces out of Dallas. He approached storage hunting the same way he approached medicine, with dedication and patience that made everyone around him take notice. Then, during the show's third season, something shifted. Mo only appeared in 3 episodes of what would become the final season of Storage Wars. Texas. Fans noticed. Even when he did show up, something was different. The energy was still there, but something behind his eyes had changed. The cameras never explained why, and the show never addressed it. But what no one knew at the time was that Mo was already fighting for his life. Around 2015, he was diagnosed with a serious illness. The exact nature of that illness was never publicly specified. But from what followed, it was clear that the prognosis was not good. Mo didn't broadcast his suffering. Instead, he went home to the house he shared with his wife, Michaela, and closed the door on the auction world that had brought him so much joy. For 6 years, he fought hard. But on March 4, 2021, Morris Prigoff passed away at the age of 78. Mo Prigoff's silent departure left fans wondering what else had been hidden from them. But the next loss could not be hidden. What happens when a fight like this plays out in front of millions? Gunther Nezvoda. The terrible news arrived in September 2022. The Nezvoda family heard the words in a doctor's office, and the room seemed to shrink. Rene Nezvoda, who had appeared alongside his father on Storage Wars for years, felt the floor drop. Casey, Rene's wife, reached for his hand, and Gunther himself sat quietly as he processed that he was dying of lung cancer. There was no denial. Gunther had been a smoker for 30 years. He had quit long ago, but the damage was already done. But instead of letting Gunther fade out quietly, his family decided to fight it. Rene, who had built his own name on Storage Wars as a sharp bidder and sharper talker, became his father's voice. He posted updates and asked fans for prayers, shared photos of Gunther from better days, long hair, bass guitar, standing on stages that seemed a world away from storage lockers and auction yards. Here is what fans did not know about Gunther Nezvoda until he was dying. Born in Vienna, Austria, on January 8, 1956, Gunther had spent 10 years in Germany as a professional bass player. He had shared stages with the likes of Leslie West of Mountain, George Lynch of Dokken, and Kevin Dubrow of Quiet Riot. He had played alongside musicians who worked with Chaka Khan and Sandy Nelson. He had lived the kind of life that reality television could never capture. Then he retired from music in 2005, not because he had to, but because he had more lives to live. He picked up a camera and became a photographer whose work appeared in ads for Microsoft and Ford Motor Company. He picked up scripts and became an actor in Oscar-nominated films like The White Ribbon and The Counterfeiters. By the time he appeared on Storage Wars, Gunther had already accomplished more than most people accomplish in 3 lifetimes. But none of that mattered in September 2022. None of it could stop what was coming. The chemotherapy began, and then the complications started. The chemotherapy was meant to kill the cancer. Instead, it began damaging Gunther's already weakened lungs. The cure became the killer. The family tried everything. They arranged to fly Gunther to Salt Lake City for emergency surgery. Doctors there were ready. They had a plan, and they had hope. But by the time Gunther arrived, The damage was already too severe. There was nothing anyone could do. On the night of March 21, 2023, Gunther Nezvoda passed away in his sleep, surrounded by his family. He was 67 years old. It was hard, but his family continued appearing on Storage Wars after his death. They had watched him slip away despite their best efforts, but the next cast member gave his family a different kind of scare. What happens when the danger doesn't come from illness, but from a split-second mistake? Barry Weiss. When Barry Weiss returned to Storage Wars in 2021, he walked with a cane, moved more slowly than he had in previous seasons, and occasionally needed help climbing the stairs at auction yards, but he was unmistakably himself. Fans who saw him on screen could hardly believe their eyes, not because he looked older, but because most of them had already attended his funeral, online. The rumor began in the summer of 2019, following a motorcycle accident in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. A car had pulled out of a parking space directly into Barry's path, and the impact threw him and his friend Jamie onto the pavement with devastating force. Paramedics arrived to find Barry barely conscious, his back broken, his femur shattered, and his chest crushed from the collision. He had to be airlifted to a hospital, and the fact that he needed a helicopter rather than an ambulance told everyone how dire the situation truly was. Emergency spinal surgery followed, along with metal plates, metal screws, and days in the intensive care unit where machines tracked every breath and every heartbeat while Barry's body fought to hold on. And then came the silence. The doctors did not know if he would live or die, and the family closed their doors and focused on the only thing that mattered: keeping Barry alive. The internet, however, cannot tolerate silence. Within weeks, someone posted that Barry had died. Someone else shared the post, and then a few news outlets repeated the claim as if it had been confirmed. Fans flooded social media with tributes, filled YouTube comment sections with RIP messages, and shared clips of Barry's best moments from Storage Wars. The truth took months to emerge. Barry survived the surgery, survived the ICU, and then faced the long, grinding work of recovery. By the fall of 2019, 3 months after the accident, Barry finally walked out of the hospital, thinner than before, slower than before, leaning heavily on a cane, but unmistakably alive. Most people who survive that kind of accident never return to their old lives. They retire, take up gardening, and give interviews about how grateful they are to be alive. But not Barry Weiss. He took time to heal, certainly, but in 2021, 2 years after the accident that nearly killed him, he stood in front of a storage locker with a cane in one hand and a bid card in the other, cracking a joke about the price of cardboard boxes. Who else in the Storage Wars family had to fight battles that threatened not just their careers, but the lives of the people they loved most? The Dodsons. Every episode of Storage Wars begins the same way, with an auctioneer standing behind a podium in a cowboy hat, delivering a rapid-fire chant that ends with a gavel slamming down and changing everything for the bidders in the room. That man is Dan Dodson, and beside him, calm and precise, his wife Laura Dodson keeps the chaos in check by processing paperwork, tracking bids, and making sure the entire operation does not collapse into shouting and confusion. For fans of the show, the Dodsons were the constants who opened every auction and closed every deal. And for each other, they were partners in business and in life. But behind the cameras, that partnership was tested not once, not twice, but 3 separate times between 2014 and 2018. The first crisis came in 2014 on a morning that began like any other. Dan Dodson was at home when he felt a sudden explosive pain inside his head that was nothing like a headache or dizziness. Within moments, his vision blurred and his speech became distorted. Laura looked at him and recognized the signs instantly, rushing him to the hospital where doctors ran scans and then delivered news that would stop anyone cold. Dan had suffered a double brain aneurysm, meaning 2 bulges in blood vessels that could rupture at any moment. When one ruptures, the mortality rate is terrifying, but when 2 rupture at the same time, the odds are essentially a coin flip at best. He needed emergency surgery that required opening his skull. The surgery worked, but the recovery was slow and painful, with weeks turning into months, and moments when Laura wondered if he would ever be the same again. Dan's speech returned in pieces, his strength returned in fragments, and then, slowly and steadily, he healed. He returned to the auctioneer's stand with the cowboy hat, the rapid-fire chant, and the gavel, and fans never knew how close they had come to losing him. But 4 years later, the second crisis came in 2018, and this time, the roles were reversed. Laura began experiencing symptoms that were impossible to ignore, including slurred speech, dizziness, and confusion. And Dan, who had almost died from a brain aneurysm 4 years earlier, recognized the warning signs immediately and rushed her to the hospital. Doctors diagnosed her with a minor stroke, also known as a transient ischemic attack, which is essentially a warning shot from a body that has been hiding its condition. The news was devastating because Laura's career depended entirely on her voice, and a stroke that damaged her speech could have ended everything she had built. But because she received immediate medical care, the stroke caused no lasting damage. Her speech returned within weeks, and within months, she was back by Dan's side. Which story stayed with you the most? And which one did you never expect to hear? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.